The check was $800, and every man on the Salt Creek Road knew exactly what Della Pruitt ought to do with it. The insurance company had taken the better part of 2 years to pay it. $800 for the windstorm that had stripped a whole slope of slate off the old stone barn back in the spring of '72 and let 2 winters of weather into the haymow. Now, in the raw middle of February, the check came folded into the same mail that carried the seed catalogs, and the answer seemed plain to everyone in the county but the woman who held it in her kitchen and turned it over twice. Take it into town. That was what they said. Put it down on one of the new steel pole barns the implement dealer had going up on a lot by the highway. Bright galvanized metal, wide as a church, a whole building poured on a slab and bolted up in a week. Take the 800, the men at the feed store said, and let a dozer push the old stone pile down into its own cellar hole, where by the look of that leaning east wall it had been trying to fall for 40 years anyhow. Della Pruitt did not take it into town. She was 58 that winter and 4 years a widow, running 11 head of cattle and a hillside of thin limestone ground alone, on the place her people had held since before the roads in that part of south-central Indiana had proper names. When a man at the counter finally asked her straight what she aimed to do with her windfall, she told him, quiet. While she counted her change, she was going to fix her grandfather's barn. That was the barn on the hill above the house, the one Elias Pruitt had raised in 1885 when he was a young man and the best barnwright on the creek. A bank barn, they called that kind, built right into the southwest slope of the hill. So a loaded wagon could be driven straight in at the high side onto the threshing floor, while down below, on the low side, the cattle wintered under a foot of oak and stone. 2-foot walls of limestone quarried off her own hill and pointed up in lime. A frame of hand-hewn white oak above it, mortised and pegged, not a nail of iron in the joints of the whole of it. 89 years it had stood there, and in the last 10 of them, with Elias long dead and her husband 4 years gone, the East Bay had taken on a slow lean, a slope of the roof had blown bare, and the barn had gone gray and sway-backed against the sky like something kneeling down to die. The place had come to Della through her mother, who had it from Elias. And Della had been born in the house at the foot of that hill and had never once lived anywhere else. Her husband Harlan was 4 years in the churchyard, and the 2 of them had never had children to leave the ground to, so there was only Della and the 11 head and the hill and a barn on it. People took that for the reason. A lonely woman, they said at the store, gone sentimental over her grandfather's rock pile. They were not entirely wrong about the sentiment. They were only wrong about what it was worth. By the end of that first week, the name had gone up and down the road as a name will at a feed store in February, when there is nothing to do but talk. They called it the widow's ruin. The salesman from the highway lot heard what she had to spend and began leaving his brochures in her mailbox, glossy pictures of white steel barns standing on bare slabs, a new one every few days until the stack on her table was an inch thick. Up in a week, the brochures promised, worth every dollar. She used the backs of them to write her feed lists on. She had a reason for what she was doing. But the reason was not a thing she could hand across a feed store counter. It was wrapped in oilcloth on the shelf above the wood stove, and no living hand but hers had opened it in a very long time. It was her grandfather's book. Elias Pruitt had been a framer of barns before he was anything else, and like a good many country builders of his day, he had kept his knowledge in a book he made himself, a thick hand-sewn thing, its pages the color of weak tea now, the ink gone from black to a soft brown. Drawings mostly joints drawn in careful section as a doctor draws a bone. Roof pitches worked out in a cramped hand. The rise and run of a threshing ramp. Notes on where to quarry and when to fell oak so the sap was down, and how long to slake lime before you trusted it to a wall. And on one page, under a small, neat drawing of the very barn that stood on her hill, her grandfather had written the thing Della had carried in her head since she was a girl. She had read it first at 9 or 10, sounding the words out by lamplight, and thought it was a kind of poem. She was 58 before it occurred to her that it might have been instructions. Set the barn in the hill, he had written, and the hill will take the wind. Stone below, pegged oak above. A barn that bends its joints will outlast the barn that fights. She did not fully understand it, and she did not pretend otherwise, not even to herself. She did not know the why underneath the words, but she had known Elias Pruitt's barns her whole life, had watched them stand through 80 years of the worst weather that part of Indiana could throw while newer buildings came and went around them, and she had reached the age where she had decided to trust the old man's hand over the young salesman's brochure, even if she could not have told you that February precisely what she was trusting. There were other lines in the book, and she read them all that winter as some women read Scripture. On the making of mortar he had written, slow lime, slow work, a wall to outlast the man who lays it, and she took him at his word on that too. And in the very back of the book, on the blank leaves where Elias had once kept his building accounts in columns of pennies and dimes, she took up a pencil one evening and started an account of her own. At the top of the first clean page, she wrote the number she had to work with, $800. Under it she meant to set down every cent the barn cost her as the old man would have. It seemed the right place to keep it. It seemed, in fact, like the only account that would ever balance out as she wanted it to. The spring came on wet, as an Indiana spring will, and she worked the barn through the mud of it. She started with the walls, because the book started with the walls. 90 years of freeze and thaw had chewed the old lime mortar back to sand between the stones until in places she could push her whole arm into the wall to the elbow. So she mixed mortar the slow way Elias had drawn it, hydrated lime and clean sand and a little cement, and a handful of long hair from the tail of a bay horse worked in to bind it. And she let it sit and sour and slake, as the book said, before she ever carried it up the scaffold. She raked the dead mortar out with a bent iron and a wire brush, a joint at a time, and pointed the fresh lime in with a trowel no wider than 2 fingers, working by daylight when there was any, and by a kerosene lantern hung on a nail when there was not. Lime and sand and cement and the horsehair for the binding ran her a little better than $60 at the start. She wrote it on the back leaves and drew the new figure under the 800. Then she went back up the scaffold. Over the big wagon door on the high side there was a flat arch her grandfather had turned in stone without any centering that anybody living had ever seen. A shallow span of wedged limestone that carried the whole weight of the mow above it on nothing but the lean of the stones against one another. And one keystone in the middle of it had slipped a ½ inch in 90 years. She wedged it back and pointed it, and it never moved again. It was the kind of thing no man in town would ever climb up to look at, and she did it as carefully as if the whole county stood watching, because the book had a drawing of that very arch and a note beside it in her grandfather's hand about the set of the key. The lean was the harder thing. The east bay had settled where a sill had rotted at one corner, and the whole frame had racked over with it, so that the great oak posts stood a hand's breadth out of plumb. She bought a pair of iron screw jacks second-hand off a farm sale for $25, and she cribbed them up under the sagging plate on stacks of oak block. And she gave each jack a quarter turn every few days, no more. A quarter of an inch a week, no faster, because the book was plain that a frame which had leaned for 10 years would crack if you hurried it and settle if you did not. All through March she turned those jacks a quarter inch at a time and watched a chalked line she had struck across the post. And one gray afternoon the line came true, and a mortise up under the eave drew shut with a sound like a knuckle popping. And the east bay stood straight for the first time since before her husband died. She cut new pegs as the drawing showed, rived them out of a white oak the wind had thrown the winter before, so the wood cost her nothing but the labor, shaved them 8-sided with a draw-knife, and drove them home green into the old joints with a wooden maul, so that as they dried they would swell and lock and never let go. Where a tenon had punked away she scarfed in new oak and buried the splice inside the joint where no eye would ever find it, because Elias had drawn it that way, and it seemed to her a discourtesy to the old man to do it any other how. A neighbor slowed his truck at the foot of the lane one raw morning and sat a while with the window down, watching her 40 feet up on a plank scaffold in the wind, an old woman in her dead husband's barn coat, pointing lime into a wall 1 2-finger trowelful at a time. He did not get out. After a minute, he rolled the window up and drove on to town. And by the time she came down for her dinner, the story of it was already ahead of her in town, and it had grown in the telling as those stories grow. The roof she saved for last, and it cost her the most. She rehung the whole bare slope the 72 storm had stripped, one salvaged slate at a time, hooked and copper-nailed so the nails would never rust and bleed. And she ran a spool of galvanized wire along the ridge courses and cinched every top slate down against the wind, and she flashed the valley with tar out of a can. Copper nails and slater's hooks and the wire and the tar and a few sound slates bought to make up the broken ones came near $100 before she was done, and there was the winter's feed for the cattle on top of it. By the middle of March, when she totted up the column in the back pages, the $800 had come down to a little past $200. Down below, in the banked lower level where the cattle wintered, she mucked out 90 years of pack and limed the floor sweet and forked down clean straw and moved her 11 head in out of the mud to a stone room that held the day's warmth into the night as a cellar does. She would stand in there of an evening with a lantern and listen to them work at their hay in the dark. 11 head breathing in a room her grandfather had laid up stone by stone, and it was as good an argument as she had for what she was doing, even if it was not one she could make to the men in town. For the men in town went right on. The implement dealer told anybody who would stand still that the widow had bought herself a museum and would be wanting a ticket-taker next. The salesman's brochures kept coming, and the feed store kept the name warm on the counter through the whole wet spring, so that by April there was hardly a soul on the whole road who called the thing on Della Pruitt's Hill anything but the ruin. The county extension agent came out in the 3rd week of March. He was not an unkind man, and he did not laugh. He walked the barn with her, up on the threshing floor and down in the stone stable, and he ran his hand along the fresh-pointed wall and allowed that it was fine old work. And then, standing in the wagon door with the wet fields going out below them, he told her, gently, as a man will tell a thing he is sure of, that she was pouring good money into sentiment. The future was steel and slab, a barn a man could raise in a matter of days and insure for its full worth. He had the figures back at the office if she wanted them. He called the barn, kindly, a sentimental money pit, and he did not mean a thing in the world by it but to save her from herself. She thanked him for coming and did not argue. Arguing was not a thing she did. Then, the last week of March, a plain, hard windstorm came through. Nothing with a name. Just the kind of blow that shoulders across the county every spring, and it caught one of the slates she had lately rehung and flipped it off the ridge and sent it sailing down to shatter in the barn lot. One slate. She found it in the morning, 100 pieces in the mud, and by noon it was all over the feed store that the ruin had started to come apart before she had even finished patching it, that the old pile was shedding already and her $200 with it. She climbed up that same afternoon and set a new slate in the gap and cinched it down with the wire and said nothing to anybody, because there was nothing in it worth saying. There was a paper on her kitchen table that whole spring that she never quite put away. It was the demolition man's estimate. She had sent for it back in the fall, in the low weeks after the check first came, when tearing the barn down and being done with it had seemed for a few days like the sane thing a sane woman would do. His price to bring a dozer out and push the barn into its own cellar hole and haul off the slate was written across the bottom, and there was a line for her signature, and she had signed it. She had signed it in October and then not mailed it, and it had sat on the table under the sugar bowl all winter and all spring, signed and going yellow, while she spent her $800 the other way. There came one evening near the 1st of April, rain on the black glass, the tally in the back of the book down to $40 and some odd cents, every joint in the barn pegged tight, and every slate cinched down, and nothing left to do now but wait and see whether an old woman or a whole county had been the fool. When she sat a long while at that table with the lamp on the yellow paper, she did not sign it again. It was already signed. She did not mail it either. What she did was get the book down off the shelf and open it to the page with the drawing of the barn, and in the margin beside her grandfather's hand she wrote the day's date and 3 words, that the East Bay stood true. Then she put the estimate in the stove and watched it go. The 3rd of April, 1974, came in wrong from the first light of it. It was too warm for the season and too still. A wet, heavy warmth that sat on the fields and would not move, and the air had a green taste to it that anybody who had farmed that country long enough knew to mistrust. She knew it when she went down to the barn at dawn and the cattle would not settle, and she knew it again climbing back to the house, and she turned the kitchen radio on and left it running. The radio grew that day as a bruise grows. By dinner time, the announcer's voice had a tightness under it. There were watches, and then there were warnings. And then the warnings came faster than the man could rightly read them. A county and another county. Towns she knew and towns she did not. Word came of a thing that had happened to a place called Xenia over in Ohio, and to Brandenburg down in Kentucky, and later to Monticello up in the north of her own state, though the whole tally of it. 148 funnels down across 13 states before the 2 days were out. The worst outbreak of tornadoes the country had ever set into its books. None of that would be counted up and named until long after. That afternoon there was only the radio getting worse, and the light going strange, and the cattle bawling down the hill. By 5 o'clock, the southwest sky had gone the color of a day-old bruise, green, black, and boiling, and the first hail came down the size of mothballs and then the size of hens' eggs, hammering the tin of the corn crib like the end of the world had got hold of a drum. The town's civil defense siren wound itself up somewhere off across the fields, thin and far. And then the wind came up under everything, and she never heard the siren again. What she heard instead, building out of the southwest, was the sound they all tell you about, and you never believe until you are standing in it, a low freight train roar, the roar of a train that never passes and never lets up, coming on across the ridge. She got down to the barn with her coat over her head through hail that cut, and she drove her 11 head down into the stone stable on the low side and through the plank door and dropped the oak bar. And then, because there was nothing else on God's earth left to do, she stood in the dark of the lower level with her back against 2 feet of her grandfather's limestone and her arms over a heifer's neck, and she waited in the roar. She could see none of what happened up and down the road that evening, but her neighbors saw it and told it after, and it was always the same in the telling. They saw the new barns go. Across the fence on the next place, the steel barn that belonged to a man named Lyle, the newest and the brightest building on the whole Salt Creek Road, not 2 years bolted to its slab, took the wind broad across its flank, and the big sliding door on the south end let go of its track, and the storm walked straight into the middle of it. For one held breath, the whole bright building seemed to swell like a lung. Then the roof peeled up off the walls as a lid peels off a can, one long sheet of it, and went up into the dark end, over end, and wrapped itself around the crown of a sycamore 200 feet back in the woods. The walls went after it, panel by panel. And where a fine new barn had stood there was a bare slab in the rain and a man's whole year of grain flung across 3 fields. Down the road a machine shed folded flat over a new tractor. A grain bin tore off its ring and rolled across the blacktop into the ditch like a dropped bucket. The pole barns up and down that road opened like tin cans in the wind, every bright new one of them, and gave the storm everything they had inside. And low in its hill, its bermed back turned to the worst of it, the old stone barn took the same wind and did a different thing with it. The frame moved. That was the part she never got over telling, that the whole oak skeleton above her leaned all at once, a slow-living, give like a big animal shifting its weight in its sleep. And the joints she had pegged all spring talked to one another in the dark, a whole chorus of green oak creaking and working. 3 slates went off the windward slope with a sound like plates breaking. A draft came under the wagon door hard enough to lay the lantern flame flat along the glass. And then the frame came back. It settled where it had leaned and settled again, and the roar climbed the far side of the ridge and began to draw off to the east, dragging its train behind it, and the barn stood over her cattle in the dark exactly as it had stood over 89 years of Aprils. And the rain came down straight and steady and ordinary into the wreck of everything around it. The first light came bobbing down the road not an hour later, while the rain still fell. It was a lantern, and behind it a set of truck headlights, round and yellow, swung in at her lane. It was Lyle, from across the fence, the man whose bright barn was in the treetops now, and he had come the length of the road on foot and by truck through downed wire and standing water, driving what he could still find of his cattle ahead of him in the dark. His herd had blown loose when the barn went. Some of them were cut where the flying steel had caught them. Some he had not found yet and would not find until morning. and the rest he had brought, storm-crazed and streaming, up the lane to the widow's ruin, because in the whole black wreck of the Salt Creek Road, it was the one building with a roof still on it and 4 walls still standing under the roof. He stood at her lower door in the rain with a halter rope in each fist and could not seem to find the front of a sentence. "Della," he got out, and then stalled and started over. "My barn's in the trees, 2 years old, and it's in the trees, and I got no place to put 'em, and I couldn't think where else on this road there'd still be a roof." The rain ran off his hat brim between them. "I know what I said all winter. I know what I helped 'em call it. I got no business standing at your door." She did not make him say any more of it. "Bring them into the dry," she told him. "There's room enough and hay enough, and the arguing can keep till it comes light." She lifted the oak bar and swung the plank door wide, and the lantern light fell out into the rain. And she stood back and let him bring his cattle in out of the storm and into her grandfather's barn. They came in trembling and rolling their eyes, and they smelled the dry and the hay and the warmth of her own stock, and they settled. And then there were more lights on the road. Word travels on a night like that, even with the phone lines down. A boy sent running, a horn tapped twice in the dark. And before midnight the lane was a slow parade of lanterns and headlights and horse trailers, every family along that road that had lost its barn or its fences or its nerve, leading and driving and hauling its surviving stock to the only shelter left standing. A man she knew only to nod to on the road put his head into the lantern light, rain sheeting off the brim of his hat, and asked it straight out. "Widow Pruitt, is there any room left in there?" There was. "Get them down here into the stone," she called back over the wind. "There's wall enough for all of it. Cattle and more cattle. A neighbor's 4 big Belgian mares that had gone clean through a board fence and were shaking head to hoof. A man's whole string of feeder calves. Past 20 head of cattle and 4 horses stood in Della Pruitt's stone bays that first night, packed in warm among her own 11, steaming in the lantern light, and the 2-foot walls that a county had called a ruin held every one of them while the rain hammered the fields to mud outside. Once the animals were in, the barn worked like a thing that had been waiting most of a century to be asked. The men strung their lanterns down the oak beams overhead and bedded the horses up top on the dry threshing planks and the cattle below in the stone, and they took the watch 2 at a time while the others slept in their trucks in her lane. Somebody built a fire out in the yard and set a coffee pot at the edge of it, and it did not go cold for days. A boy walked the stalls every hour with a water bucket, and the sound of all that stock working at borrowed hay under a sound roof, with the wind still worrying the ridge, was the first easy sound any of them had heard since the sky went green. She was up before the light, and the morning the storm left behind it was the kind of cruel, clear morning that comes after the worst weather. The sky washed a deep, rinsed blue without a rag of cloud on it, and a low gold sun coming up over the ridge and firing every wet thing it touched. It lay along the limestone of the old barn and struck the wet slate roof and turned the whole hillside of new spring grass to something that hurt to look at. Steam came up off the backs of near 30 head of stock in the barnyard and off the whetstone walls themselves, so the barn stood there, smoking in the cold sun, with the whole road's animals bedded safe around it. Della stood in the center of that barnyard in that light, with her hands full. She had gathered the lead ropes as the neighbors turned their stock out to graze the safe side of the hill, a fist of borrowed halters and lead ropes of every color, red and blue and a frayed yellow, and the barn lantern still lit in her other hand, though the day had long past the need of it. Across the sagging wire fence, on the next rise, Lyle's steel barn lay peeled open and flattened, its sheet metal wrapped silver into the black line of the trees, a bare slab shining with rain. And along her fence stood the men. The ones who had kept the name warm at the feed store all spring stood in her barnyard that morning with their caps in their hands, looking from the flattened bright wreck of their own new buildings across to the old stone things smoking on the hill with their cattle safe inside it. The implement dealer, the one who had laughed loudest of anybody that spring, turned his cap once around in his hands before he got it said. "I sold this whole road on steel this spring, Della. Stood at my own counter and called that barn of yours a rock pile." He looked back at the bare slab shining across the fence. "I don't rightly know what I'll tell them come Monday." She let it sit a moment before she answered him. "Tell them their cattle are fed and dry," she said. "The rest can keep for a better morning than this one." And after that, not one of them had a word left to say about a widow and her ruin. For near 3 weeks the road's animals stayed on her hill while the neighbors dug out and strung new wire and argued with their insurance men. She turned no one away, and she took no one's money, though it was offered and offered again. She fed out her own hay to other men's cattle until the mow was near bare. And when a man pressed a folded bill on her at the gate, she folded it right back into his shirt pocket and asked after his wife. A week into it, in the dark of the stone stable among all those borrowed animals, one of a neighbor's heifers dropped a calf a full month early, and it lived, warm on the limbed floor her grandfather had laid down, stone by stone. The man came to lead his cow home at the end of the 3 weeks, with the calf riding in the bed of his truck, and he stood at Della's gate a long time trying to say a thing he did not have the words for. And in the end, he went home without saying it. She did not need him to say it. And somewhere in those 3 weeks, the question started going around the county that the feed store had never once thought to ask all spring. Not why the widow had wasted her $800. The new question was the opposite of that one, and there was no laughing anywhere in it. How was it that the oldest, cheapest, most laughed-at barn on the whole Salt Creek Road was the one thing the worst wind in the history of the country could not so much as take the roof off of? The answer had been in the old man's book the whole time, and it was not sentiment. It was engineering, and it went like this. Start with the hill, because Elias had started with the hill. He had not set his barn out in the open on the flat, as a pole barn goes up on a bare slab where a man has the room to back a truck around it. He had cut it into the southwest slope, banked to the earth on the weather side, so that better than half the building had a hillside at its back instead of a wall. When the storm came up out of the southwest and climbed that hill, the ground threw it up and over, and it spilled across the low pitch of the roof and was gone down the far side, and the barn had only ever shown the wind half of itself. The new barns had stood up naked in open lots and caught the whole weight of it broadside, flat wall and flat roof, with nothing at their backs to hide behind. The hill did for the stone barn exactly what the old man's line had said it would. Then there was the mass. A wall of limestone 2 feet thick weighs better than a ton to the running foot, and there is no wind that blows will pick a ton up off the ground. The stone did not need to be strong against a storm. It only needed to be heavy, and it was heavy past all arguing. And so it simply stood there and let the wind wear itself out against it. Then there was the frame, and the frame was the cleverest part of all of it. Hand-cut oak, mortised and tenoned and locked with oak pegs, and not one nail of iron, a frame built that way has give in it. Every joint can work a little, can lean and rack and come back, the way a big tree bends in a gale and does not break. That was the thing her grandfather had written down and she had read as a poem, that the barn which bends its joints outlasts the barn that fights. When the great gust hit, the old oak leaned and let the wind pass and settled back true, because she had pegged it green and jacked it plumb, and the joints did just exactly what the old man had drawn them to do. The steel barns could not bend anywhere. They were screwed up stiff and rigid. Light framing and lighter sheeting bolted hard at every corner, and a thing that cannot bend anywhere, when the wind at last asks more of it than it can give, does not lean. It breaks all at once everywhere. And a pole barn, for all it costs a man, is at hard a sale. Broad flat panels of light steel, hung on posts, stood up in the dirt. And the wide doors a man needs to run his machinery through are the ruin of the whole thing, because let the wind in at one big door, and it fills the building like a held breath and lifts the roof off from the inside, pushes it off as a flat palm pushes a lid up off a pot. The neighbor's fine barn had not been torn apart from the outside at all. It had been blown open from within, because it was light and it was stiff, and it was standing out in the open with its door square to the storm. The old builders had known every bit of this, up and down that limestone country 100 years before anybody thought to give it the name of engineering. They set their barns into the west and the southwest slopes on purpose, with their backs turned to the worst of the weather, low and heavy and made to bend. Della had not needed to understand all of it that February when she chose the book over the brochure. She had only needed to trust that a man who had watched the wind for a lifetime and written down what he learned of it had known a thing the salesman on the highway did not. The lean she had feared had been nothing but 89 years of an old frame shifting on one rotten sill, and once she had raised it plumb and driven it new pegs, the barn was as sound as the morning her grandfather first raised it into the sky. She never charged a neighbor a dime for the weeks their stock stood on her hill. And in all the years that came after, she was never once heard to say the old name back to a living soul, though there was hardly a family on the road that had not helped to make it. When Lyle went to rebuild across the fence that summer, Della walked the length of the road with the book under her arm. This was never mine to keep on a shelf, she said, and put it in his hands. Open to the leaf with the small, neat drawing of the bank barn on it, he read it a long time standing on his bare, wet slab. I can't make out half his hand, he said at last. You don't need to read all of it, she told him. Set the new one down into the hill and give it your back to the southwest. My grandfather drew you the rest of it before either of us was born. And the new barn he raised that year he did not set out on the flat where the old one had blown from. He cut it back into his own hillside, low, with its shoulder to the southwest and its back to the weather, as the drawing showed him, as the old men had always done it before the salesman came. The county extension agent, the same one who had stood in her wagon door in March and called the barn a money pit, and had meant it for a kindness, drove the county roads for a week after the outbreak with a clipboard, looking at what had stood and what had not. And what he found, he wrote up himself and sent out under the county's name that fall, that all across the limestone country the old earth-banked stone barns had ridden out the outbreak where the new steel buildings had failed, and that there was sound reason in the old way of setting a barn down into a hill. He named the builders he could still find names for. And in the middle of that bulletin, in plain print, he named Elias Pruitt. who had set a barn into a hillside above Salt Creek in 1885 and had built it, the agent wrote, a great deal better than he knew. Della cut that bulletin out and did not frame it. She folded it once and laid it inside the back cover of the book, next to the account where the $800 ran down the page to $40 and some odd cents, an account that had balanced out, in the end, exactly as she had wanted it to and could never once have said out loud. Then she wrapped the book back in its oilcloth and set it on the shelf above the wood stove where it had waited out the better part of 100 years. But before she closed it, she turned once more to the page with the drawing of the barn, and under her grandfather's hand, under the oldest words in the whole book, she took up her pencil and added a date of her own, the 3rd of April, 1974, so that whoever came after her and opened the book would know that the barn had been asked the hardest question the sky had to ask, on the worst day that country ever wrote down, and that the hill had taken the wind, and the old oak had bent and held, and the barn her grandfather set into the slope had answered for itself, while the whole road's cattle slept warm and safe. Inside it,